Church History, England, Lights and Shadows of the Reformation. London, G. Morrish, 20, Paternoster Square, before 1915. Republished by Irving Risch. Host of Down to Earth but Heavenly Minded podcast. If the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed. Wiclif. In the year 1365 the Pope, Urban V, came into collision with England, by arrogantly demanding the annual rental of 1,000 marks promised by King John, see note. With the arrears of many years then due. The English failing to pay this, the Pope claimed possession of England as his kingdom, and ordered King Edward III to repair to Rome, note. King John, when excommunicated by the Pope, and in danger of an invasion from France in 1213, had said, I promise to pay him, the Pope, 1,000 marks yearly, to wit, 700 for the Kingdom of England, and 300 for the Kingdom of Ireland. The value of a mark was 13 shillings and 4 pence. End of note. No little consternation was caused in England by this demand. The papal party were in high hopes. England had already enacted some statutes denying the right of the Pope to appoint foreigners to high offices in the English Church, and prohibiting anyone from bringing to England, or from receiving and publishing, any bulls or excommunications from the Pope. But now the Pope was only asking for that which had been promised from England by their own sovereign. How could it be refused? Wiclif, see note, by this time was about 40 years old. He was a Christian. He had passed through soul trouble on account of sin and the judgment of God, and had found peace in studying the Scriptures. He resolved to make known the treasure he had found. Note, Wycliffe's name is spelt in about 20 different ways. He was born in 1324 at the village of Wiclif, near Richmond in the county of York, from which village he received his name. Surnames were not yet in common use, and people were often called after the place where they were born, or where their parents owned property. Thus John Wiclif would be originally John de Wiclif, John of Wiclif. End of note. In 1361 he had been chosen Warden of Balliol College, and in 1365 Warden of Canterbury Hall, at Oxford. In these offices he made known and expounded the Scriptures to the students in the week, and on the Sunday he preached in simple language the same truths to the people. Wiclif heard of this demand of the Pope, and he strenuously opposed it. He may have been appealed to by the king, and if so, it would have been his duty to reply. But otherwise how much better it would have been had Wiclif left the matters of the state to those whom God had placed over the nation, and kept to the work God had given him to do for the souls of his hearers. Parliament was summoned amid great excitement, and proceeded to discuss the question. The friends of the Pope were of course in favor of the money being granted, but many could not see what the Pope had to do with demands on their country. England belongs not to the Pope, said one. The Pope is but a man, subject to sin, but Christ is the Lord of Lords. And this kingdom is held directly and solely of Christ alone. It would have been more to the purpose had they quoted the passage in Romans chapter 13 verse 1, the powers that be are ordained of God. God had ordained Edward III, and not Urban V as King of England. After much discussion the demand was refused. The friends of the Pope declared that by the canon law England belonged to the Pope, and the Pope could now lay claim to the country. But who had made the canon law? The popes themselves and their councils. What authority then had the canon law? The canon law has no force, said Wiclif, when it is opposed to the word of God. This demand made on England and its refusal brings out one of the reasons why the Reformation was needed. The popes laid claim to authority from God over the kings in Christendom, and when they chose they not only excommunicated a king from the church, but they also declared that he was no longer kind, and all his subjects were justified in refusing obedience to their sovereign. See note. Note. In 1077 Henry IV, Emperor of Germany, having been deposed by the Pope, was made to divest himself of his robes, and, in a coarse woolen garment, stand barefooted and fasting from morning till sunset for 3 days, before the Pope would even admit him into his presence. In 1213 King John of England delivered his crown to the Pope's legate, who kept it 5 days to show the Pope's authority over the king. End of note. The Pope found it was of no use to try and enforce his demand on the English, yet he was loath to lose both his spiritual and his temporal power over England. So he brought about a conference at Bruges in 1374, to which Wiclif repaired with other commissioners. The chief points before them were the statutes which related to the Pope's ecclesiastical powers in England. See note. The conference ended by a compromise. The king was to repeal the penalties against the agents of the Pope, and the Pope agreed to confirm the appointments of the king. The people, however, were displeased. The clerks sent from Rome, said the House of Commons, are more dangerous for the kingdom than Jews or Saracens. The Pope had asked too much, the people begrudged him anything. Note. The principal of these was called the law of praemunire, so called from its commencement, praemunire facias, cause to be forewarned. The first statute was passed in 1306, another in 1352, another in 1392, which is the one generally referred to under the above title. Others to meet abuses were passed from time to time. The Pope had not only appointed whom he would to the higher offices in the Church, but had nominated persons to fill vacancies long before the vacancies occurred, so as to keep the succession in his own hands. End of note. But the sojourn of Wiclif abroad was of great use to him. Like Luther's visit to Rome, it opened Wyclif's eyes to the wickedness of the papal system, and confirmed him all the more in his judgment against it. On his return he was made rector of Lutterworth. Here he preached the gospel to the people. The gospel, said he, is the only source of religion. The Roman pontiff is a mere cutpurse, and, far from having the right to reprimand the whole world, he may be lawfully reproved by his inferiors and even by laymen. Such language, however, could not be allowed. The Pope had many friends in England, and many in power. They beheld with alarm the spread of Wyclif's doctrine, and set to work to crush him. On February 19, 1377, Wiclif was summoned to St. Paul's, London. It awoke great interest, and a large concourse of people flocked into the cathedral. All were more or less excited, and many were holding animated conversation. But the hum was hushed on the approach of the man for whom all had been looking. But he came not alone. First came Lord Percy, Marshal of England, then Wiclif and the Duke of Lancaster, followed by 4 monks, bachelors of divinity. All eyes are turned on Wiclif, who had been charged with heresy. The church was thronged with friends of the Pope, and it was with great difficulty that Lord Percy and those following could make their way to the place where the bishops had assembled. As they pushed their way, they encountered the scowls and frowns of the crowd, who would gladly have laid hands on Wiclif had he been alone, but they restrained themselves before his noble protectors. At length they forced their way to where the ecclesiastics were assembled. Bishop Courtenay presided, who was not a little disconcerted to find that Wiclif was protected by 2 of the most powerful men in England, and a few angry words passed between them. Lancaster foolishly whispered to one near him that he should like to pull the bishop out of the church by his hair. Some standing by heard this, and they at once made such an uproar in defense of the bishop that Lancaster and Percy had to defend themselves, and make their escape from the church as best they could. After cautioning Wiclif, the meeting broke up, nothing being really done. Wiclif again went on with his preaching, but the Pope concerted measures to have him effectually stopped. For this purpose, later in 1377 he was brought before the Archbishop. Men now expected he would be condemned. He was before the highest ecclesiastical dignitary in the land, and the king, Richard II, being but a child, could not interfere. But Wiclif had a friend in the Queen Mother, and scarcely had the Archbishop commenced proceedings against Wiclif when Sir Louis Clifford entered the chapel and forbade the court to proceed. The bishops were confounded, but felt they had no power to resist, and gave way. Wiclif handed in a protest and retired. The protest said, "I do mind and intend with my whole heart, by the grace of God, to be a true Christian. And as long as breath shall remain in me to profess and defend the law of Christ. If any things he held could be shown to be wrong by Scripture, he was ready to revoke and renounce them." Wiclif was now left to go on with his work. That work increased in value in his own eyes. He greatly desired to have the gospel preached in all the dark places of England. To his disciples he said, "Go and preach, it is the sublimest work, but imitate not the priests whom we see after the sermon sitting in the alehouses or at the gaming table or wasting their time in hunting. After your sermon is ended, visit the sick, the aged, the poor, the blind, and the lame, and succor them according to your ability." Alas, what a picture of the practice of the priests in those days! They too often went from the pulpit to the tavern or the gaming table. What fruit could be expected from such labors and such laborers? Wyclif's evangelists scattered themselves abroad. With staff in hand they went forth, living on alms, as was the custom, and preaching the gospel by the wayside, in churchyards, or wherever they could find hearers. Wiclif had taught them that salvation was not in angels or saints, but in Jesus Christ. An angel, said he, could have made no propitiation for man, for the nature which has sinned is not that of the angels. The mediator must needs be a man, but every man being indebted to God for everything that he is able to do, this man must needs have infinite merit, and be at the same time God. The regular clergy were alarmed, and obtained a law to forbid the evangelists, and then from their retreats they would watch for them, and running out fall upon them. But the people often took their part, and forming a strong ring round the preachers would not allow him to be hurt. Thus by the means of these devoted evangelists the gospel reached many a dark corner of our country, and a yet future day alone will reveal the result of the good seed sown. Wiclif, besides this work of evangelization, still discharged his duties as professor at Oxford, when in 1379 he was taken dangerously ill, and all thought he would die. The papal party were in joy, but to make their triumph complete they hastened to his bedside to induce him to retract before he died. You have death on your lips, said they, be touched by your faults, and retract in our presence all that you have said to our injury. Wiclif was calm and serene, and for a time held his peace. The priests were full of hope, and waited, expecting to hear his recantation. They had brought with them 4 aldermen, so that their report of it should not be called in question. Wiclif begged his attendant to raise him up. Then summoning his strength, though he was dreadfully weak, with piercing gaze he said, I shall not die, but live, and again declare the evil deeds of the friars. Disappointed and confounded they retired from his room. The reformer began to recover, and lived to accomplish a yet greater work than he had hitherto done.